Joining me now is Dr. Evan Wilson, Associate Professor at the Hattendorf Historical Centre at the US Naval War College and author of The Horrible Peace, British Veterans and the End of the Napoleonic Wars. Evan, thanks very much for your time. Let's dive right into this. After the war comes, of course, the demobilization. What options do these soldiers actually have once Napoleon has been defeated for the final time?
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So the 7-year men, the short service men, get out. Almost all of them are going to get out sometime between 1814 and 1816, 17. So there's a pretty hefty demobilization then. But when they get out, most of them don't have skills beyond agricultural laborer. And there's a major agricultural labor crisis in the country in 1815 and 1816, especially because of the eruption of Mount Tambora that happened in April 1815, which caused a global climate catastrophe. I think people watching this know that this has been pre-recorded, so I will allow that to happen. But it is currently feeling very much like 1816 here in the East Coast of the United States, because there are major wildfires in Canada, and the sky is basically yellow and orange, and the air quality is terrible. And I can tell you that if it felt anything like this in 1816, it was truly a horrible piece. So crops didn't grow. This was the year without a summer in 1816. So there's no jobs for agricultural laborers. So it's widespread misery. Lots of reports coming back to the government about widespread misery. So not a lot of options for soldiers who are getting out of the army in the years immediately after Waterloo. A lot of them take to the streets and protest because they think, hey, this can't stand. We need to do something about it. Some of them use their military training to make protests more effective. And that's the story that I try to tell in my book, which you should all buy. The Horrible Peace. It's out now.
People absolutely should. Now, there was a lot of stigma attached to being a soldier during this period. How does society kind of respond to this influx of what are effectively trained killers onto the job market?
I have a little more to say in my book about what the soldiers do, and that is they commit a lot of crimes. So there's a major crime wave after Waterloo. The Old Bailey records show, roughly speaking, there are about twice as many crimes committed in 1819 as there were in 1814. So it's a dramatic increase. So lots of transportations to the colonies, to Australia, to places like that. There are also resettlement schemes. The idea is basically, okay, we don't really want the soldiers here in Britain, or the demobilized soldiers here in Britain. They're, crime-ridden and difficult people to be around. Let's get them out. If they're not committing crimes actually, and we don't transport them, we could maybe incentivize them to move to the colonies. So in the 1820s and into the 1830s, Canada and Australia both have major settlement schemes where soldiers are encouraged. They're given basically free land as long as they maintain it. They're given a certain number of acres based on how what their rank was. So a private might get a small plot, but an officer would get a much larger plot. The idea is basically that soldiers would make good frontiersmen. You can see the logic, right? They're trained to survive ideally in difficult conditions, but it assumes a bunch of skills that soldiers don't necessarily have. And it turns out that they're not actually great frontiersmen, and they're not great settlers. But nevertheless, some do take up the opportunity. And so there are these schemes that run in the 1820s and 1830s. By the middle of the 1830s, most of the colonies have decided maybe this wasn't such a good idea. But what's fascinating is that you can find evidence of the soldiers' settlement patterns all through the colonies. So look for Napoleonic era names throughout Canada and Australia, and chances are they were founded by a soldier who named his farm after his rifle regiment or whatever, the rifle battalion. So that there are lots of different places you can look for this in the colonies.
I want to talk about the psychological impact too. Talk us through kind of a couple of examples of this which you've come across in your research.
So it's really hard, and we probably shouldn't retroactively diagnose PTSD, but the actual name of PTSD, right, post-traumatic stress disorder, it is absolutely clear that a lot of these men underwent trauma. Therefore, when there's trauma, there is often PTSD. But we shouldn't say, oh, that guy definitely had PTSD. It's more complicated than that. It's hard as a historian sometimes to find exactly how to handle this. The term that they would have used at the time was probably something like melancholy. So they say, I'm suffering from melancholy. Maybe that is because of their experience in the war or some other thing, or maybe it's just alcoholism or whatever it is. But the sources that we have for this are often memoirs. Memoirists tend not, you don't usually write a memoir when you're about your post-war experience if it was all, smiles and kittens and two children and a white picket fence or whatever, right? It was often the case that the memoirists would write about their difficult experiences in the war. And so we have some evidence of what a difficult experience might look like, and that could be a real feeling of dislocation. And I think that's a more common and easier to diagnose understanding of what it was like to have left the military. So the regiments deliberately created, Army regiments deliberately created homes away from home to try to separate soldiers from their families, to make the regiments feel like their new family. So if you're dislocated from your family, that can cause a lot of trauma in and of itself, regardless of what you saw in battle and what you saw in the war. So you read a lot of memoirs of soldiers who they say that they are like, after they've left the Army, they're like fish out of water, which I always thought was a fascinating framework, because the sailors generally don't say that. The soldiers all say they're fish out of water, which says something about something. I'm not quite sure. But anyways, so the soldiers say, we're fish out of water. We don't know how to handle this post-war period. I don't know what to do with myself. I feel like I'm not at home anymore. How do I make a life for myself? And it gets back to this fundamental problem that soldiers don't have marketable skills, generally speaking, in the civilian market. Some niche aspects of soldiering do, but compared to sailors, where there's at least a chance that you could translate your maritime skills into a merchant ship if you could find a job, which you probably couldn't, but never mind that. The theory works, right? Soldiers don't necessarily have anything that they can bring home to say, hey, I'm good at this. There are a couple examples of like accountants. There's a lot of paperwork in the Army. So if you're good at the paperwork in the Army, sometimes you can translate that to that kind of skill. But yeah, a lot of sense of dislocation, a lot of sense of being removed from their home, rather than saying specifically, oh, that guy had PTSD. That's dangerous.
And you come across some really curious ones. So, for example, we've spoken in the past about a guy who decides to blow up a tree stump because it seems like a good idea at the time.
Yeah. So this is an old cavalryman who is, to be clear, not trained in the use of explosives, and that becomes important in the story.
Don't try this at home, folks.
Exactly. Yeah, he stays in. So after the wars, he'd enlisted in about 1806. He goes through the whole peninsula. He's at Waterloo. He stays in the whole time, and he gets all the way through into the late 1820s when he hits his 21-year mark. And at that point, the math just, you should get out because your pension's probably going to be better than staying in. So he decides, all right, I'll get out. He goes back home, and he just can't feel at home at his old home. He says every stream he sees reminds him of a stream that he crossed in Spain, and there was a battle fought there. So he decides, well, my job right now is going to be to get rid of an old oak stump. And if anybody's ever had to deal with a tree stump, you know that like that's a real job. You need actual machinery to do that. But he decides, no, I got explosives and I know what I'm doing because I was in the Army. So I'm going to blow this thing up. And of course, it explodes before he expects it to. And he says, the town gossips were all like, what is this idiot doing, trying to kill us all back from the Army, right? So that's a good example of someone who doesn't feel at home when they come home. He goes back to his regiment to visit, and he says, I immediately felt more at home in the barracks than I had in the last couple of years than I've been at my actual family home. So that's the kind of common dislocation that you see. And again, don't try to blow up a tree stump.
That's good life advice there. Just going for you for free. That's what we do for you folks here on Waterloo Live. I'm very interested in the support that does, and in some respects doesn't exist for the wounded. We talk a lot about the Chelsea pensioners, but in practical terms, does a pension really help that much if you have sustained a wound?
So it's important to distinguish between the two different kinds of, really there's three different kinds of pensioners. There's the ones who don't get any. That's an important category. Okay. But of the ones that get a pension, there are in pensioners and out pensioners. There really aren't many in pensioners. There's a reason they trot them out today at all these major events, because there aren't that many of them. And so you see the same guys over and over again. The Greenwich Hospital for the sailors has I think less than 2,000. Chelsea similar. So, a couple hundred, couple thousand, depending on the year, depending on all that stuff. The vast majority of pensioners fall into the 80,000 Chelsea outpensioners ballpark in about 1820, let's say. These numbers don't take these numbers to the bank, but that's to give you a rough sense of scale. So let's say there are 80,000 Chelsea outpensioners. An outpension meant that you didn't live at Chelsea Hospital, you didn't get a room and board, you didn't get any of that stuff. All you got was a quarterly payment, a pension that was dispersed to you. You'd usually have to go to your nearest excise office to get it. The state, however we want to define that, the army, parliament, the government, was very clear that this was not your income. This was not meant to be, you're going to live, on the pension for the rest of your life. This was supposed to be drinking money. It was supposed to be a supplement to your income. And in some cases, when it worked, it literally was drinking money. So because you didn't often live maybe right next to the excise office or wherever you had to go to get the pension, you travel with your buddies every quarter down to the pension to get your pension. And then you'd probably drink it all. And then you'd come back feeling good about yourself. And then you do that again in 3 months. So that's the ideal. In practice, though, with the unemployment crisis, the agricultural labor crisis, and the post-war economic depression, a lot of soldiers relied on the pension to get by, and that was a bad situation to be in. So a typical pension would be a shilling a day, ballpark. A shilling a day is about 18 pounds a year. It's hard to give precise numbers here, and this changes over time, and there is inflation. But let's say that you probably needed at least 40 pounds a year to sort of make any kind of reasonable ends meet. So 18 pounds a year isn't going to do that. Now, if you can make money as a laborer, and then you also have 18 pounds on top of that, that's fine. Like, it's not great, but you can see the theory. So the pension depended on the severity of your wounds. If you weren't wounded, it depended on how long you served, that sort of thing. So you had to show how disabled you were. If you were severely disabled, you lost a limb, you might get a bigger pension, but then your chances of working were lower. So I understand how the state's just trying to sort of even it all out here, right? So no, there's not a lot of support for them. It is, however, the first state welfare system of any kind of meaningful of any kind of value. So this is not new to the period. This is not new in 1815. It goes back centuries, various kinds of pension schemes. But it's interesting to see the state recognizing that it had some sort of obligation to these men, that it needed to provide them with something, but it wasn't willing to provide them with a livable income. That just wasn't on the cards, and it wasn't what the pensions were designed to do.
And how much beyond that, how much public recognition do veterans get, obviously aside from the Waterloo Medal, which is sort of a unique thing in and of its own right?
Well, the fact that the Waterloo Medal is unique is exactly the key. So the General Service medals, the Peninsular War medals, those stuff don't go to regular soldiers until the 1840s. So for 20, 30 years after the wars, you'd say that ordinary soldiers were not recognized by the state in the same way that officers were, with the exception of the Waterloo Medal. And now the exception of the Waterloo Medal is the exception proves the rule, right? The fact that it was such a unique thing is exactly the point. Waterloo was seen as such a world historical battle that it was worth recognizing everyone who participated in it. And so the state went to all this trouble to print these, to mint these medals and all the rest of it. So if you'd ask, who are the people that are recognized after Waterloo, you'd say the officers of both services. They are raking in all sorts of rewards, knighthoods, peerages, medals, all the rest of it. The Navy had been giving out medals for major battles for a long time, but they weren't given to everybody who participated in them. And it was usually something that officers got. So the general sense of ordinary soldiers after Waterloo, aside from the Waterloo Medal, these are not worthy of the state's recognition until they're all dying off in the 1840s. And then people say, oh, maybe now's a good time to recognize what you've done 30 years earlier.
Yeah, a little bit late for many of them, of course. Dr. Evan Wilson, it's been a fascinating discussion. Author of The Horrible Peace, British Veterans and the End of the Napoleonic Wars. Thank you for joining us on Waterloo Live.
Thanks, Zach. Thanks for having me.